Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Security Tapes. Today we welcome Renaldo Jack. Ronaldo's with us from Globaleq, and the title of today's cast is Bridging the Gap, Aligning OT Reality with Boardroom Strategy. So quite an interesting subject. I know you've got quite a lot to offer us on OT, Renaldo. Ads, have you got a question to start the interview rolling, if you like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the thing that always comes to mind to me when we're talking about OT is the slightly tentative relationship between OT and IT and getting the two teams to work together. And I guess really your thoughts on that.
Well, good morning, everyone. And yeah, thanks for that question, Adam. So, it's the old age issue. We've got IT guys that's really strong in IT, loads of experience around technology. Specifically, nowadays it's cloud, we've got cybersecurity at play. But in OT, now we're talking about engineers, we're talking about chemical engineers, electrical engineers really specialize the skills and masters in their area of expertise. And now with the convergence between IT and OT, it requires these two different spectrums of people to start speaking to each other and aligning minds and finding a common ground. And I think the challenges here is, in many cases, it relates to ego. On the OT side, we've got people that make sure that the operations run smoothly 24/7. And then you got this IT guys coming, telling them you need to do things differently. This is the way you're supposed to do things from a cyber perspective. And that creates that internal conflict. And I think it requires, both parties to kind of sit back, trying to understand that we are on the same team here and we're trying to achieve a common business goal. Because while the two competing parties are having these arguments amongst each other, we've got the external hackers and cyber criminals taking advantage of that.
Absolutely. And the priorities in OT are very, very different to OT. We commonly think of, when we come into cybersecurity, we think of the CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, availability. And with OT, almost the biggest thing is the availability, maintaining that uptime, especially when you're dealing with manufacturing plants or power plants. And uptime is key in a way that it just isn't in our.
100%. I think the other one we commonly also miss out, although the CIA triad is flipped upside down, another key aspect for businesses across OT, manufacturing, oil and gas, is health and safety, right? In every organization, health and safety is going to be the top priority where people speak about. Now, typically with cyber, we kind of latch onto that notion of safety because for cyber is around safety. We maintain the cybersecurity of the safety systems and the high availability of the operating plan and processes. So, absolutely, that's key. I mean, when we talk about and the integrity of the processes, making sure that it's repeatable, it's understood that there's a certain outcome based on input, and then following that with how confidential or sensitive is information that needs to be worked with.
That's interesting. And it's interesting you brought up the health and safety aspect of it. Because when I did a couple of OT courses a little while back to bring up my knowledge a bit. And it was interesting going through that because there was a big, big focus on the health and safety, but also the worst case scenario, the idea that these plants, there's dangerous substances around, there's heavy industrial machinery around. There is a real threat to life in some of these environments if they are manipulated or messed with by threat actors.
Absolutely.
And in some cases, and our instructor was telling us, in some cases he's had people in the class who have known colleagues who have lost their lives. In very, very extreme examples. Obviously, it's not too too wide, and we wouldn't want to go sort of down the fear-mongering route. But it would be really interesting to sort of delve into that without getting sort of too sensational, if that makes sense.
Yeah, true. And I think that's probably in extreme cases. And I think there's not widely publicized examples of where this happens often, maybe in extreme cases. But, hypothetically, if you think of an oil and gas plant,
Yes.
or you think about a nuclear plant even.
Yes.
So you've got an attack remotely that exploits, let's call it, the SCADA systems. So these are the systems that control the physical processes or equipment. So if they're able to bypass the safety systems that's supposed to switch off any malicious activity, and potentially opening a valve or closing a valve when it's supposed to be open, you can imagine that pressure building up, leading to leakages or spills. And eventually it could lead to explosions or fires. And further to that, we've got environmental impact, right? So let's say there's poisonous gases that makes it up into the atmosphere or surrounding areas. It leads to health and safety issues in the wider public and society. So there's further consequences. I think in the digital world, as we said, we're more concerned around how do we keep this information secure.
Yes.
But in the OT world now, there's physical consequences, that's real, tangible. That's quite different to the digital world.
Enough, I was talking with some colleagues the other day around an OT environment, and there was, I think in this particular case, there was widespread default credentials set by the vendor and left in place. And the assertion was that, oh, look how insecure the environment is, isn't that terrible? And it was, my first thought with that is, I would be surprised if the engineers on site didn't know that default credentials were in place, and the priority is easy access, smooth flowing of the environment. They might not have been in a position to even change those credentials. And I think, again, it goes back to that sort of different set of priorities, different set of standards, and having very, very long timelines where people on site actually have the ability to make changes.
Right. You made a good point around these default credentials. I think that's a common issue, right? In many cases, it's more around the changes, the configuration changes you've made with the existing technology that's in place. A lot of the time, the OT equipment gets shipped on site, it gets installed. The first priority is get us up and running, right? Let's get productive. But smaller things in their minds from an engineer perspective is not thinking about changing a password. It's that lack of awareness and different priorities, as you mentioned. And I think this is where cyber teams and leaders come in to create that awareness around what are the common hygiene and things that needs to be in place to what we call reduce our attack surface of any operating plant, right? And it's small things. Sometimes, for CISOs, you don't actually need this big, huge budgets. You can start with basics. It's certain hygiene to get you up to a certain level. And it's mainly of doing things different and just tighten things up to make it difficult for the attacker to get in initially. If we look at advanced threats, which I'm sure we'll speak about later on, AI, etc., I guess those basics needs to be in place, but you also then need to kind of get AI in to fight AI with AI. But I'm sure we'll expand on that conversation.
Absolutely. So before we dip into the particulars, we've talked a bit about the differences between IT and OT and some of the challenges that the site engineers and the people securing the site actually have to contend with in an operational technology environment. It would be useful now, I think, to talk about the decision-making level, the board level, and that's really the main topic we're going to get in today. As I understand that you've got some real insight and some real thoughts around communicating these risks and getting the the problems in OT across the board in a way that can be easily understood and actioned.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely for CISOs or leaders, I think the main challenge is getting the language right when speaking to your boards or
Right.
peers at executive level. Traditionally, we speak IT language, we speak the technology language, and it doesn't really resonate with board members. They don't understand it. And frankly, sometimes they don't care. They're in the business of creating profits, adding value to shareholders. And so, it requires CISOs to adapt the language, understand financial terms, financial modeling projections, and showcase how your financial position is at risk, potentially due to a cyber attack. But moreover, it doesn't really stop there. We need to kind of position the value of cybersecurity as well. What value is it going to bring in business terms? For example, a manufacturing plant operating out of South Africa. It could be the strategy is that they want to expand the market into Europe, for example. And with that, there's certain regulations from an OT side, but also from an information perspective, right?
Mm.
So where cyber can really add value is to ensure that they position cyber as an enabler to meet compliance objectives, for example, GDPR or NIS2, which is the manufacturing standard in Europe. So by aligning that, you directly add value to the business objectives and strategy over the long term. So it's kind of that balancing act between risk management and value generation. And I think that's key to make sure that whatever we communicate with the board or the execs resonate with them in business language.
Perfect. And I guess in that way, it doesn't sound that dissimilar to IT once you get to the business and decision-making levels.
Absolutely. I mean, if we talk about CIOs, their main job is position IT as an enabler to the business, right? Where there's digital transformation. In the same way, this happens in OT. We spoke about the convergence between IT and OT, cloud and OT. And there's no such thing as an air-gapped environment anymore. We all know that. So by converging these worlds, you get better analytics, predictive analytics for maintenance and processing. But with that, we said we're bringing in cyber risks, which were traditionally only isolated to IT. So yes, by positioning cyber as an enabler, we're very similar to IT.
Perfect. And it would be quite handy to understand some of the specific technical risks that you might bring up with the board to help them understand the risk to the business, the risk to specific sites, and how you might approach that language-wise.
Sure. What I usually do is because, a lot of these plants which I position with the board, a lot of the time, these operations or technology within the OT space has been designed with a lifespan of 20, 10, 20, and sometimes 30 years, right? It's been created with usability and reliability in mind. It's never been a concern around cyber because cyber wasn't a concern 10, 20 years ago. So what happens is you want to kind of get the most out of the asset over a longer period of time from a business perspective, right?
Yes.
Now, the environment has changed, right? We've got operating systems in OT that's aging. These vulnerabilities are exposed to the internet and they're actively being attacked. So the challenge here is for board members to understand that we have to refresh the technology in OT. And the challenge usually is they might say, or a myth usually is, well, it's been running for 10, 20 years. Why do we need to change? Why do we need to spend any money on it? And secondly, we haven't been attacked in 20 to 30 years. Why is it a concern now? So these are all the myths you typically need to overcome with the board members, right?
Right.
And the way I position this is kind of to showcase where other organizations across the world have suffered a cyber attack, purely because of the lack of refreshing their technology. So it's always better to kind of demonstrate with real attacks out in the world or through proper risk analysis
Yeah.
and assessment.
Do you have any particular case studies you like to lean on? You're not allowed to use Stuxnet.
Stuxnet, yeah, that's the old one. One
Yeah.
of the originals, I guess, that everybody kind of,
Yeah.
jumps to immediately. Well, I do have a couple. I think the other one that's quite prominent these days is the Colonial Pipeline. I think back in 2021, there was a ransom group called DarkSide. They deployed the WannaCry ransomware. And we know that
Yes.
that impacted, or they had to proactively shut down the pipeline on the whole of the East Coast. So that led to fuel shortages, right? And I do believe in that case, they had to pay out 75 Bitcoins, which is roughly 4.4 million US dollars, right? Another big one that I do recall is aluminium manufacturer in Norway.
Right.
So they suffered also a ransomware attack in 2019 through a ransomware called Locker Goga, unusual name. And again, the impact there was a global production disruption. So they had to revert to manual operations in all of their plants. And they suffered a staggering 75 million US dollars in direct losses.
Right. Can I just jump in there?
Sure.
Just for those in the audience who aren't familiar with plants, industrial sites, when you say manual control or taking a process in hand, what does that mean?
Yeah. So essentially, we know, or in a typical plant or operations in OT, you have something called SCADA systems, and this is supervisory control and data acquisition. Now, these supervisory systems are operated by human beings, typically, or in many cases, they're fully automated. So they send instructions to downstream systems to perform operations, as I mentioned, opening and closing of valves or actuators, and it also collects and retrieves information back from them for decision making. So in a case where ransomware impacts those SCADA systems, it means that autonomous control or remote control is not available anymore. So it reverts back to pulling levers, flipping switches manually. It's all then physical, like the industrial age.
So you then need to go and find a ton of extra engineers to
That's
be
right.
as many workstations as you need to push the buttons, pull the levers, and operate everything by hand.
Absolutely. And the challenge is sometimes these plants or operations are hundreds of miles or kilometers away. And now to get that workload of people there, it takes time, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Could you find your flow again?
Well, yeah, I think finally on that specific scenario, in this case, Hydro did have cyber insurance. They were only be able to recover 3.6 million of that 75 million. So you can see it's a small portion, but the actual business financial losses there was staggering. I mean, there's more cases. There's JBS Foods, the health industry, the energy sector, car manufacturing. We see this across all industries, geographically. No country to date has actually been spared through cyber attacks.
I'm just thinking on the cyber insurance side, because I found it interesting. The not pet year attack, whereby the insurance companies, obviously quite a lot of high profile names were hit, and the insurance companies said, this isn't a ransomware attack, this is an act of war, because of where it originated from. Now, you may be aware, Ronaldo, the high profile cases and the fact that as it happened, the insurance companies had to settle. Going forward, they've obviously tweaked their policies now. And when I was thinking of yourself and Globaleq, and I'm thinking about the geopolitical aspects, and I'm thinking about the different nations you're in, and thinking about the very real threat now geopolitically, and the fact that given where some of the threat is originating from, insurance companies are not going to cover you. How have you found that affecting you? How have you dealt with that?
Yeah, geopolitical tension is a concern, right? If we know this geopolitical tension, it typically flows over into cyber attacks by nation states. As I mentioned, we operate over 8 countries within Africa. A lot of these countries are actually not exposed to this geopolitical tension that's usually happening in the Middle East, in Europe at the moment. But if we look forward and strategically, with that can easily shift within to our
Yes.
geographical area. So we are being proactive to looking at cyber insurance proactively for these different locations, both from an IT and OT perspective, to cover our organization holistically. Um, and I think, in the cases where recently there's been payouts for organizations for cyber attacks, I think in a way, those insurance companies were not in a position to not pay out. It's part of their marketing, it's part of their business model. But rightfully, as you said, it's likely they're going to change their policies and make it more difficult to actually meet the criteria either for insurance, or the likelihood of payouts is probably going to reduce and the premiums is going to increase over time. So I think as the industry, we need to find a way to either working with the insurance companies or really to decrease our own risk profile and not just rely on cyber insurance. It's a reliance on the different layers of cybersecurity, of which insurance is just a component of it.
Okay. So talking about decreasing the risk profile, what would you say the biggest risks are that you see without naming names or exposing people too much?
Yeah, and so in general, I think supply chain risk and third-party risk is a common issue, both from an IT and OT perspective. We've got supplies coming in from certain countries like China, which is obviously a big manufacturer in the OT space. So this requires organizations to really look closely at, who's applying or manufacturing this, how security considered through that supply chain or manufacturing process. And in addition to that, third parties, a lot of operations or organizations make use of third parties or even fourth parties. They're typically smaller. Cyber is not a real concern, or they don't really have a specific budget to look at cyber. So while we're kind of securing our environment or our own kingdom, you're kind of opening the doors to a third party that's less secure. And the cyber criminals and attackers know this, right? They're going to try to find the easiest route in. So for me, number one is supply chain. We've also seen the increase of AI now. So you imagine trying to combat AI type of based of attacks that is changing on the fly in real time. It can pull exploits from the internet at lightning speed, and it can really adjust their cyber attack against your organization in real time. And to keep up with your manual controls is a losing battle. So I think those are the two key ones. There are others, but I'm probably going to pause there just a little bit for you to respond.
Sure. When we talk about supply chain risk, I think I have a couple of things come to mind, and the first is the physical kit that's actually on site. Your industrial kit that's manufactured by whoever, and then you've got the various controllers, the PLCs, manufactured by Siemens, Honeywell, whoever it is that you happen to be using on your particular site. And then there is the vendors that actually support you, perhaps the integrators, and quite often the engineers will actually have, I don't know if the correct term is a back door, but they will have privileged access to the site so they can quickly remote in, carry out whatever work or monitoring that they need to. And that itself is a major route in.
So, when it comes to third parties, there's two ways they connect, right? One is remotely into the plant, and the other is they come physically on site. The
Yes.
challenge is with the physical route is they usually bring their own laptops or USB devices in because they have proprietary software or firmware which they need to plug into your OT equipment. So that is a big risk, right? In many cases, that's a personal laptop, they connect at home. You don't understand the posture of that laptop. So you inadvertently expose your operations to a, non-malicious, or initially thought about non-malicious way of supporting your business. So that's the one key issue here. The other one is where we have, as I mentioned earlier, SCADA access that's directly exposed to the internet, right? It's exposed for anybody to attack. It's got simple authentication. So
Yeah.
those are some basic things to kind of really be aware of and lock down.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And say we're going to ask our integrator or vendor to adopt better hygiene on their systems, or we're going to make some changes, whether it be to passwords or to physical kit on site, and we need to take that to the board and decision makers, and we might need to think about some downtime. And I'm aware that the windows for being able to push changes on OT are much, much longer than IT, sometimes as long as a year, 18 months. How do you pitch that to the board to say, no, this is really, really important. We need to compress the time window and actually speed things up quite a bit. Otherwise, we are dramatically exposed, and the alternative would be pretty undesirable.
Absolutely. So it's like we said before, right? One is to really drill through or drill down the actual business consequences of not performing a certain action, right? I think that's always the starting point. But also, as I mentioned, what's the value we can unlock if we do put the security or robustness in place? We will have more resilient OT operations if we do suffer a cyber attack. We're able to recover, for instance, recover from backups, to restore the configuration, to make sure that we can resume operations as soon as possible. When it comes to third parties supporting this for us, we kind of manage this through contracts, right? We say, instead of being very prescriptive around the cybersecurity measures that we need you to put in place, we rather simplify this by saying you need to align to certain industry standards like the IEC 62443 or the NIST frameworks for industrial control systems. That way, the liability and the ownership shifts more from the organization to that of the third party because they need to comply with that. They need to provide assurance that they've got the relevant security measures in place, and it can independently be verified to provide, our board assurance that cyber is being maintained at a plant that's maybe operated by a third party. In terms of the time span of getting this into place, it's really best to pick the maintenance slots where the plant performs operational maintenance so that you kind of align with that downtime. Because having a cyber downtime together with operational downtime for maintenance and support, you kind of have too many times of maintenance and support that kind of impacts productivity and financial losses. So you kind of have to align with the schedule of what's available already.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you have playbooks and scenarios taken into account where you have something really more immediate, sort of a break glass situation, if you will, where you have to
Absolutely.
make decisions on a much, much shorter time frame. Can you talk about sort of what kind of situations might merit that to, again, the more extreme situations where you might have to consider taking systems in hand or islanding part or a plant in its entirety?
Yeah. So again, we take a risk-based approach to cybersecurity. So there's a couple of things that could influence whether we need to respond immediately, right? One being retrospectively post the cyber incident. Okay. So if an incident's happened, it caused a business disruption, we have to respond immediately, right? To both fix that incident or issue, but also then put proactive measures in place to prevent reoccurrence. So that would be one scenario. Another scenario would be um, a competitor or another organization suffering a cyber attack at their OT plant. We will then proactively go and assess our environment to see are we exposed to the same type of cyber attack. And depending on what that third party experience or the business impact to our organization, we will then proactively intervene to put that proactive measures in place as well. So it kind of depends on the scenario. We've got proactive systems that kind of assess our exposure. And again, based on the risk posture or the risk profile, we then make decisions to intervene sooner and to kind of close the gap sooner, depending on the risk.
Nice. So one of the things I picked up on that is not only being aware of what's going on in your environment and your company, but what's going on in other providers, other companies in the industry, and whether they're exposed, if they've had issues. And we're getting into threat intelligence. Where is the best source of information around threat intelligence and getting sort of the clearest, most pragmatic data to make sensible business-based decisions, particularly in OT? I'm aware that a lot of your suggestions now are going to be for Africa rather than Europe or the US or Asia. But it'd be useful to hear some of those resources you've got available to you.
Sure thing. I think it's definitely a combination of both open source and proprietary threat intelligence. Again, we don't limit ourselves to a geographical area when it comes to threat intelligence. I think that will be short-sighted because we still operate on a global stage, even though we're physically present within Africa. And cyber threats can easily pivot from one location to another because it's all interconnected on the internet. So typically we work with our managed security service providers. They get exposure to other organizations globally, and internally they've got shared intelligence. I'm also part of several bodies external to Globaleq where we freely share and collaborate around threats, around best practices, changes in regulations, and how to combat these issues to make sure that obviously we improve our risk posture internally. So as I mentioned, it's a combination of things. We heavily rely on third-party threat intelligence, especially the bigger players that, it's got footprints in every major continent and country. And we try to automate those threat intelligence feeds into our central security operations center so that we can, move at speed and we can pivot and adjust to make sure that we're proactive in our approach to combating threats.
And I guess we can't really talk about threat intelligence without getting on to advanced persistent threats and how they kind of work their way through the organization. And before we talk about this, again, for the non-OT audience, it would be good to sort of lay out how a very, very typical site might be set up, where you've got a standard sort of IT perimeter and gradually moving down through the layers, getting closer to OT with some intermediary systems that are still IT with a bit of an OT leaning. Would that be fair, a way of describing it?
I think at a high level, that's spot on. What typically would happen is you would have your IT network and you would typically have that connected to your OT network through some type of firewall, right? And in many cases, you would also have cloud that either is connected to your IT environment, and through that, you expose your OT environment. In other architectures, you might have, cloud directly connected to OT, again, through a set of firewalls. So that very first layer is really your firewall, whether it's a next generation firewall, nowadays with AI intelligence, etc. Once you get below that firewall in the OT environment, we typically align what we call to the Purdue model. So it's a layers of networks in between, starting at layer 5, working its down layer 4, 3, right through to 0. And 0 is really the physical device, the sensor, the actuator that processes the physical environment. Now, within a typical OT environment, you would also have what we call the DMZ or demilitarized zone. And in there, you would typically have your cybersecurity technologies or even your critical OT systems that plays both in OT and IT, as you mentioned. For example, you would have historians. And the function of the historian is really to collect information from your PLCs, from your controllers and field devices, store the information or analytics within a historian that's then later processed to make decisions around maintenance or further investments. Um, Again, you would also have, for instance, jump hosts that would typically
Yes.
sit there, as we mentioned. You get a third party that needs to perform maintenance or support. They would typically go through this jump box, and the jump function of the jump box is really to, um, be a middleman between your internal environment and your external environment. On this jump box, there's secure hardening, there's more monitoring. Um, it's making sure that you can track every activity from an attacker or from the legitimate person that's coming into environment. Another way also to look at this is what's called honeypots. I'm not sure if you're
Yes.
familiar with the term.
Of course.
And this is typically you put a device down that mimics an OT device or an IT device or a combination of both. And the idea is to really make it easy and kind of lure the attackers or even an advanced persistent threat into your honey pot. So as soon as you trigger that, it will alert you to that and you can then perform your response activities. I think that's a powerful, low cost solution for CISOs and cyber leaders to have in an OT environment.
Absolutely. And of course, the old sort of favorite fundamental techniques, things like segregating your network, particularly that control layer where you have your historians, your HMIs, stuff that is very much going to be of an interest to an attacker wanting to influence or learn more about the industrial process. They're going to be going after that layer and those systems and indeed the people operating them.
Absolutely. And you made a good point there because you have to identify what are those critical systems, business critical systems, that's fundamental to your mission of the organization, or in other terms, what we call crown jewels. So,
Yes.
and those systems you would then segment behind firewalls in what I said earlier, the DMZ, where you have heightened monitoring, controls, both physical and digital, and as well as you mentioned, the people working in that. Typically, we know these days cyber criminals target humans. They try to exploit humans. So you
Absolutely.
need to have a robust cyber awareness program tailored to the roles within OT and IT. So it can't just be generic because that is not contextualized into how an attack would, develop for an OT engineer, for example. So it's really making sure that you compartmentalize those safety and critical systems behind firewalls and between network segments.
Absolutely.
Ah.
So I think the thing that comes to mind, because I'm a pen tester, I'm a career hacker, so I'm always looking at routes through organizations, and that is really not a huge amount different on an OT site. And we've discussed several ways in. You might want to access the control layer by reaching an engineer directly through their workstation. You might go in via a vendor or an integrator, or you might attack IT in the organization itself, attempt to get into the normal company systems running normal company stuff, nothing to do with OT, but attempt to access OT through that environment and kind of worm your way through, bouncing from system to system until you get to the low-level processes. In terms of, again, helping boards understand that IT and OT are in many ways inextricably linked, how do you get that across? How do you message that?
Well, I think we mentioned this before, right?
Mm.
It is this convergence. If we as a business or any OT operations operated a plant that's completely isolated or air gapped,
Yes.
I think it will be significantly harder for cyber criminals, to gain a foothold. But because of this digital convergence, we're now bringing, traditionally OT protocols were non-routable. So in other words, You couldn't hop from one device to another. You couldn't change the direction of the flow. But these protocols are now operating over what we call TCP/IP, which is an IT-based protocol. And so, because it's routable, attackers usually find an initial foothold and then look for ways to move laterally and escalate privileges. And this is all made, achievable because of this IT component connected to OT. And I think that's the way I position usually this with boards that's at least got a bit of technical understanding. It's obviously a build-up of how you educate the board around how this operation works. And I think the other key one is not just because of IT, but also the people, right? I think it's still the easiest route in to any organization, whether it's IT or OT, through phishing or other type of social engineering, because you do rely on the people factor, not to make mistakes, to be, aware
Yes.
and conscious of not clicking on a link, opening attachment, taking a free USB stick that's lying around and plug it into their
Yep.
laptop or workstation. Those are the key risks, I think.
Fantastic. So if you had to zero in on one thing and say, this is the biggest problem. This is the one thing we face in OT that if we solved this, got rid of it, dealt with it, that would dramatically lower our risk. What would you say that is?
For me, there's not one specific one that's at the top, but I think getting the basics right, it's important. Closing the attack surface, and as I mentioned before, it's not at just the technology level, it's also at a people level. Getting the basics right is getting the skill set within the OT staff up to a certain level, right? In many cases, they've got no clue around what cybersecurity is. We need to start with education. We need to close down our attack surface, close down ports, change passwords, certain hygiene of how do we allow personal devices on site. Those are all small things that doesn't require a big budget, but would really increase the security posture significantly within an organization. Small things like old laptops, making that a dedicated engineering workstation and put the Titan security on those laptops, as example. It's important to have jump outs in there. So, to make sure that you do have a layer in between. And you have to monitor the environment continuously through a SOC or a SIM. And I think the key thing is also incident response, right? You have to perform tabletop exercises. You need to get several key stakeholders in the room, make sure that in the event of a cyber attack, the recovery period as short as possible. And you kind of cannot be ready without doing any type of simulation. And I think more importantly also is, backup of configuration. This is typically only thought of as an IT issue. But if you back up a SCADA system or a configuration of a turbine or HMI, in the event this ransomware, gridlocking or taking control of your environment, as you do your investigation, identify the threat and contain that, you can already start rebuilding the plant or the affected systems in parallel. So your recovery over a shorter period of time will be much better. And your need to pay a ransom is drastically reduced as well. Because you can recover the systems, you understand how the threat came in, and then you take action to kind of put measures in place to reduce the likelihood of that threat getting into your environment again. And backing up to cloud as well, not just on site. I think that's very key as well. If your backups are compromised on site, again, you can place reliance on your cloud backups.
So
That's brilliant. Yeah. Have you got more to add there? Sorry, Ed.
So I guess the first one is roughly how often you run the tabletops and the simulations.
I think without going into specifics and give too much away,
Sure.
this is a regular thing. When I say regular, I would say at least once a year per site or location. If there's a major change in operations or in personnel, we then would probably shorten or bring that simulation forward. It's a combination of a regular schedule, at least once a year, and with major business changes.
Awesome. And my second question was more around the people piece. That was my big takeaway from that is it's fundamentally a people problem rather than a tech problem in the OT world. And as a decision maker, when you're building a team and someone who's watching this and they want to get into OT, they don't have any experience, or perhaps they work in another area of it and they want to get into the security side of it, are there any certifications you look for? Are you not bothered about certifications at all? Do you want to see specific experience and say, oh, I want to see solid engineering experience? What are you looking for if you're building a team?
Yeah. So, I think a common problem in cyber generally is what we always say, the shortage of skills, right? I think that isn't the case so much in IT anymore. We've seen
Yes.
trying to move into cyber because for many reasons, it's an exciting environment. It's growing over time. I think, apologies, the rewards are also increasing because it's quite a competitive market now. But the challenge for OT is that same skill set, or there isn't that skill set for OT. And because it is very different to your IT environment, you need to understand SCADA and get fundamentals in place. So our strategy is usually to engage with our existing staff, people that knows the operations, whether it's
Yep.
operators or engineers, that expresses an interest in cyber, or we kind of create that awareness and excitement with them. It's easier to kind of use our internal staff, create opportunities internally, and it gets away from that challenge trying to get an expert externally out of a smaller pool. So that's usually, I think, how we bridge the gap and how we create that awareness and make sure that we cover both worlds, right? Because the engineers
Got it.
know if we make this change, it will impact the business, etc.
So just to summarize that, if
Yeah.
you're someone who wants to get into OT, the engineering route is the way to go. Learning the systems, learning the site, getting that place at an employer who operates systems and sites, and then moving into security from there.
I think there's different routes, right? But naturally, I think the easiest route for me would be what I would suggest is definitely get understanding of the OT environment. First of all, get the fundamentals in place because without that, it's going to be
You can't
difficult to
play,
really
yeah.
slap cybersecurity on top of that, right? Yeah, there are definitely a lot of free resources available. For example, a good resource would be CISA ICS cybersecurity training. I think that's from the government in the US. They start really at the fundamentals of OT and they build cybersecurity on top at a low cost. And I think you need to have a hunger and a passion for cyber. It's not something you just want to do because it's the shiniest thing around and that's the trend. Because it is obviously a tough environment. Yeah, it can obviously get pressure in cycles, and you need to be able to withstand those ups and downs. In if you want to work in the cyberspace. So definitely, to your upskilling yourself, get into OT, understand how it works. If you're not already in the OT space. Yeah. So I mean, this one that jumps to mind, right? There's a water treatment facility that's operating not far from here. And so they use a smart water treatment system with thousands of automated valves and that controls the flow, the pressure, and the chemical dosing of the water. And the system was integrated with cloud for analytics, remote diagnostics, but it still relied a lot on legacy control systems at the edge. So one day the operators detected an unusual flow deviation, and the primary exhaust valve that's crucial to the pressure equalization that went offline. Okay. And all the local diagnostics showed it as healthy. And the system had a digital twin as well. It could also confirm that the valve is functioning as it should. So after investigation, it kind of revealed that an attacker exploited an overlooked vulnerability in the remote actuator firmware of that flow control system. And they deployed a subtle script that spoofed the operational signals of the OT dashboard. So the operators would look at the dashboards, they would see everything is working as it should. But locally, things are not happening as it should, right? So it's making the valve appear to be functional when it, while it remained closed. And so obviously the filtration system was affected and it caused illegal waste dumping upstream. So eventually the cybersecurity team came in, they performed forensic analysis, they identified there was actually lateral movement patterns that originated in the HVAC system or control module. It's often overlooked, right? I mean, we focus on the actual OT on the side, but HVAC and other data center equipment, camera systems, those things are all connected. And that's often overlooked. So they pivoted from there. So to fix that, they updated the firmware that was affected of the HVAC systems as well as the control valves. But it really sparked a facility-wide overhaul in cybersecurity hygiene for that organization. They had to do asset inventories, firmware validation routines, behavioral monitoring across systems. So it kind of led to a deeper collaboration between the IT and OT teams with joint protocols for anomaly response and data governance or cyber governance.
Perfect. And that's a great case study to finish on. Unfortunately, we are out of time.
We are out of time, yeah.
I wish we could talk longer, but thank you so much for your time. It's been really, really interesting talking OT. We do so much IT stuff, and it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Renaldo.